Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next segment of Moments with Mumilaaq. I have the lovely Cindy Blackstock here with me. I'm super excited for our conversations today. And of course, as always, before we get started, the purpose of these conversations is to share Indigenous perspectives, experiences, and thoughts. These perspectives are not my own. I am looking to create awareness and support discussion amongst Indigenous peoples ourselves and among Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples outside of these Zoom segments. So again, I have a very wonderful guest here with me today. And Cindy, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, thank you. And I join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. My name is Cindy Blackstock, and I have here Spirit Bear, who represents First Nations children who are working together for justice along with other children in the country to deal with the contemporary inequities of First Nations kids. Now, I grew up in the bush of northern British Columbia in the 1960s and 70s, and really saw both racism come to the surface in ways where your life as a First Nations girl was really capped at growing up to, according to society, to become a drunken Indian or to grow up to be on welfare. And that was the tone of society back then. That idea of that took away your humanity, it took away your dreams, and it trumped what you and your people could become and who you were. And so that really fueled in me an idea of two things. One is that I really saw First Nations children as being sacred and valuable in their own right, and that humanity needed to be recognized and restored. And the second thing is I started to see all the systemic discrimination. I didn't have words for it back then, but you could see it in the way that people were being treated because they were First Nations. The reserve system, for example, the idea, the status cards, all of that were markers that were to dehumanize you and make you less than others. And so that really put me on a track of looking at, well, how can we ensure that a generation of First Nations kids don't have to recover from their childhoods? How can we ensure that they walk with their heads up, proud of who they are and the distinct cultures they come from? And when I use the word First Nations, I want people to really emphasize on the S, because there's such distinctions amongst First Nations. Like, I grew up on the West Coast. I've never seen a powwow or a smudge until I was in my 30s. That was totally different for us. Or the medicine wheel, didn't know what it was. And so there are very distinct differences among these communities, different languages, and even within communities, we have different perspectives. And so I don't want to homogenize by using that word, but there are some things that are common to our experience. And so now I work on First Nations children's culturally based equity, just trying to make sure that First Nations children and their families get an equitable chance to grow up proud of who they are, to grow up safely in their families, get a good education, and be healthy.
Absolutely. And so many important things I want to touch on there. It's just a matter, I guess, of where to start. And absolutely having the S, First Nations. And I'm so picky about how we talk and language and what words we decide to use. Indigenous peoples, that S is so important because we are not necessarily a collective group. We are not all the same. We don't share the same perspectives and culture, even within First Nations groups, within Inuit. Like, there are such a variety, if you will, and even saying that sounded weird coming out of my mouth. There are such differences even amongst Indigenous peoples ourselves, and that's perfectly fine. But quite often what we see is that we're all kind of categorized into that box. And before we get into that conversation, I wanted to know what Spirit Bear has on there.
Oh, okay.
Spirit Bear
Well,
is wearing.
Spirit Bear was gifted to us by the Carrier-Secondary Tribal Council when we filed a human rights case against the Canadian government for their underfunding of First Nations children's services. And we wanted something in the room that reminded us why we were there, and that was children. So we put Spirit Bear there, but back in the day, he didn't have this wonderful outfit. But one of the groups that started coming to the hearings were children. And they would leave letters for Spirit Bear. They would take Spirit Bear and hold on to him. And eventually he started to get gifted clothes and regalia by the community members. And so you can see here he has his own ribbon shirt. That's very beautiful, right? And he has a TRC button here, and it's on a moose hide heart. Now, Moose Hide campaign is to end domestic violence in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. And it's in the shape of a heart because Spirit Bear works with children on something called Have a Heart Day, where they send letters to the Prime Minister about ending the inequalities First Nations kids face. And Senator Sinclair gave him this very special TRC button, since he's part of the TRC's calls to action. And this is beautiful. This is a turtle, beaded turtle. It was gifted to him by a community in Manitoba. And these are his beautiful cedar moccasins. And they were gifted by a family in British Columbia. But he actually has a whole wardrobe now. Yeah, and I'm going to change my computer so you can actually see what I say is real.
Wow.
And it's gifts of children and letters. And that's why Spirit Bear is so special, is he really represents the spirit and the love of children. And that's why he's been our ambassador, to really bring the message to all children that we need to stand together when people are being treated unjustly. When there's we see First Nations kids getting less because of who they are or not being honored for who they are. We all need to stand together against that, because difference isn't something to be afraid of. It's to be celebrated. And I always say difference is not, that's why I won't use the words difference, overcome difference. I don't like that. It's a celebration of difference. It's an understanding that we don't have to all be the same. We can honor and respect each other and take real pleasure in understanding that rich diversity of human experience and human perspectives. That's the richness, the heartbeat of humanity.
And I think that there are so children and youth are such. I'm not supposed to have favorites as a member, but definitely youth have the #1 spot in my heart. I love working with Northern Youth Abroad. I love working with youth. And speaking of children and activism, can you walk us through how your activism, and even that, I think that a common theme for us is going to be the way that we talk and the language that we decide to use. Because I think that often people like us label us as activists, and it's such an odd word, because what we're fighting for is equality, oftentimes basic human rights, trying to justify why our lives as Indigenous peoples should be treated equally and deserve to be treated equally. So I find that activism is such a weird word, because we're fighting for equality. We're fighting for human rights. We're fighting for children. And I think that sometimes the word activism can totally miss that mark, because you can advocate for a number of things and you can advocate for a number of issues. Why are we advocating for basic human rights and equality here in Canada? So before we really dive into that conversation, why children? Why do you choose that as your focus?
Because I believed in children. With every new generation comes a chance to create a society anew. And it's really from the teachings of elders, right? Elders, I remember Reg Croshu from the Blackfoot Nation. He said that in their teachings, children are taught everything that's important to be of a good mind in relation to one another and in relation to the world by the ancestors. And that babbling is a language of the ancestors. And he said, really, for adults, we need to remember how to babble. That's what babies gift us, is that remembering how to babble and what babble means. He says they'll learn to walk on their own. We don't need to teach them that. The gift they have is that sacredness. And I see it as children develop. You know, when you think about 2-year-olds, they understand fairness at the age of 2. And so that fairness is something we have a possibility of nurturing in them so that they don't learn our bad lessons of discrimination and of trying to have power over others. We can really learn from children, be reminded what fairness is really like, be reminded what love is like. You know, children know love, right? Their first act when they're babies is to reach out, right? And they remind us of the sacredness of love and how that has to be the foundation of a good mind and a good life. And so I think with children, if we're able to really harness their gifts as children and use them as teachers, as adults, to remind us about what's important, and treat all children as knowledge holders. So teach them what is happening, not now, and then equip them with loving, peaceful, but effective tools to address those injustices. Then together they can grow up with a different understanding of one another and be better equipped to tackle the social justice challenges that not only happen for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, but happen for other groups around the world as well.
Absolutely. And children are I was thinking of my nephew when you were saying that. And even in culture, and when you look historically, what was normal for even Indigenous groups amongst ourselves was different. But the ideas that the federal government had of what should and what should be, I don't know if normal is the right word, but how things should be, if you will, is something that is very and can be very different from our cultures, and we have such differences sometimes in our culture. And I think that that's something that Canadians don't really have a full grasp on if you haven't lived it, or you're not a part of a family or community that has had that historic violent relationship with institutions like the federal government, like the RCMP. And what people don't realize is that this is not something that happened hundreds of years ago. It's not something that happened even 100 years ago. Yes, it was started at the time, but the way I try and explain Inuit history, at least in Canada, is that it was a pack-a-punched couple decades between the 1950s and the 1970s or so. These are not our great-great-grandfathers, our great-great-great-grandfathers. These are our great-grandparents, these are our grandparents, these are our parents, these are people who raised us. These are cycles that unfortunately sometimes are still continuing. And okay, I'm gonna take it back just a step. Can you talk a little bit to, you had mentioned you hadn't been to a powwow or I believe a sweat lodge until you were older. It wasn't the norm in your culture. Can you talk a little bit about different First Nations, the First Nations group that you're a part of, and some of those misconceptions and assumptions and stereotypes that being a First Nations individual oftentimes comes along with here in Canada?
Yeah, so I'm a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, and our community is along the Skeena River in northern British Columbia. So, and it was interesting, in 1969, the members of our nation actually created a cultural village called Kisan, K-S-A-N. And what that was meant is to teach the non-Indigenous population about our culture, to try and address that racism as part of that unfolding. So we have, if you were to walk into one of our villages, we have the feast houses, we have the totem poles, we have the button blankets, but those are just symbols of a value system and way of life that goes back tens of thousands of years. We were not nomadic in our community. So as a result of that, really, we lived in a pretty defined space. We absolutely had respectful relations with our neighboring First Nations. Often they spoke either different dialects of our language or different languages entirely. So it wasn't unusual for members of our community to be multilingual. right? To have relations with these other communities around economic issues, around political issues, around a whole host of matters. So that's the way it was. But we started to see colonialism really in the late 1800s as the gold panners started coming up through our territory to get gold for gold and resources, and had suffered serious losses due to the introduction of disease. And then residential schools. And you were talking earlier about these Western views, right? You know, they would literally come into the community. And sometimes if you were a mom or dad, you were off doing something, and they would take your kids, you wouldn't even know they were gone. And in our case, they were often sent to Edmonton Residential School or to Port Alberni Residential School, two very abusive residential schools. And those children were removed and put in those schools, allegedly to be educated. But there was another assumption too, and that is that they would be properly cared for. And no one ever questioned. You know, there were all eyes on the community when they were raising their children. But as soon as they were removed, there was an assumption that these people were properly caring for them, when in fact, many children in those schools died. Many were abused. And there was no kind of attention to that question of whether or not the federal government was keeping up its promise of properly caring for these children. So those schools in British Columbia started to close in the 80s and 90s. But the outcomes of that residential school, the trauma from having generation after generation of children removed from the community. And the other side of it was adults in a community growing up in a community where there were no kids, right? Imagine what that feels like, right? So you have this weird, horrible experiment happening on First Nations folks. And then we emerge out of that thanks to the multi-generational strength that we have. I try to avoid the word healing because I think that defines a people that's only identities recovering from illness. And I think our multi-generational strength is far stronger than the unbelievable levels of trauma we've experienced. And it's also what we need to leverage to go forward. So coming out of that now, there has been a real effort to try and restore language, to restore culture, to restore people to a level of dignified living where they can grow up in a way that their ancestors would have dreamt for them. But also within a modern context, right? People sometimes think our cultures are frozen, right? And it's like frozen back there, and if you kind of continue through time, somehow things don't evolve. But I think that's garbage, to be honest. I think our peoples were always smart. They always had to evolve to changing conditions. The key is that they had key values and beliefs that guided them very much like a very important compass as they dealt with a changing world.
Absolutely. And I think the multi-generational aspect is something that is so important. And even the way we talk about our history and our different histories, it's and there are so many things that intertwine into the current day that we are in, into 2020. And I think that one aspect is, and a conversation that we are seeing more and more, is culture appropriation, and people having a really hard time being able to grasp that. And I think when you look historically, it's really hard to have those discussions, and again, justifying reasoning. And it's, could you imagine not wearing who you are, not being able to keep your hair, not being able to wear what are normal clothes to you, to live in a house or a home that has multiple generations is something that is so normal for Inuit anyways, and was until colonization, until we saw that relationship, if you can even call it that, between Indigenous peoples and the federal government. Can you talk a little bit more to, how do I say this, to bigger court, whether they're court cases or protests or bigger experiences that you have seen within your lifetime? I'm thinking about things like, we saw, for example, when Colton Bushy was killed. We saw when Tina Fontaine was killed. We saw those conversations starting to spark, but unfortunately not get us, I think, to the point where we need to. I think we have this idea that we love to talk about reconciliation, and as Canadians, we love to think we are nice and accepting and diverse and inclusive, when Canadian history and current day for Indigenous peoples, no, sorry, I shouldn't say that. For Indigenous peoples, that is part of Canadian history. This is not just our history, it is Canadian history as well. That I don't think we're at truth yet. We haven't talked about the facts. We haven't talked about the injustices. And I think that in turn has continued to create this divisiveness of Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, because oftentimes when we have a disagreement or have a debate or whatever it may be, oftentimes what it is simply lack of knowledge of understanding the history and the situation. So sorry, for all that, I was starting to go ramble there. For all that, can you talk to some of the, I would use the word historic experiences that you've been a part of or that you have seen so far?
Well, one of the things growing up is like I grew up off reserve in the bush, and we would go to the reserve on occasion, right? And I would see a lot of disadvantage. A lot of things were just harder on reserve, right? Especially back then, because residential schools, we have to remember, were still operating. But I didn't really understand why.
Sorry there. Sorry, just so we're clear, you're talking about when residential school was still operating.
I know it was still operating. So when I think about back in the 60s and 70s when it was still operating, life was really hard. And then when residential school stopped, though, what I really started to appreciate, that discrimination is not only what you see in terms of offensive language or something like the Indian Act, which is still with us as a piece of legislation that categorizes who's status and non-status people. I mean, you can't get more racist than that. But it's also in what becomes normal. And discrimination is most dangerous, I think, when it becomes normalized, and especially when it's perpetrated by the state. And it even becomes normalized amongst those who are experiencing the discrimination. Let me give you the example. So on reserve, the federal government funds public services, versus for others, it's done via the territorial or provincial government. Now, since Confederation, the federal government has underfunded all those services. And that's why we see things like so many boil water advisories. People think, well, how is it possible you can't turn on your tap and get a clean glass of water in Canada, of all places? That's why we see the underfunding of education in First Nations communities, of healthcare, of child welfare, and all of those inequalities pile up on the hopes and dreams of First Nations kids. So when I started doing child welfare, which is about now 30 years ago, we saw the symptoms of that, but people didn't do what my mom says, which is, when you come across a complex problem, look for the obvious, because almost no one does, right? No one was looking at, well, if we put any family in these conditions, cut all of their services by 30 to 50% that they and their families rely on, and then introduce the multi-generational trauma of colonialism in residential school, how well would they be doing, right? And it seemed to me to be obvious that we needed to deal with this. And it also, I was kind of naive back then. I thought if we showed the federal government, along with the experience of many other very talented and wise First Nations folks from across the country, if we showed them what the problem was with their discrimination and showed them the consequences of what happens for kids, and then more importantly, work with them to come up with a solution, they'd fix it. I mean, could anyone racially discriminate against kids, right? And so I went down that narrative for about 10 years, and that was a big mistake for me, Because had I looked back on the previous 100 years of history, I would have seen report after report. First Nations are getting less. The government acknowledges that. They know it's leading to the deaths and harms of kids, and they're not doing anything about it. So in 2007, we finally filed the human rights complaint along with the Assembly of First Nations against Canada, saying that their underfunding is racial discrimination against at least 165,000 kids. And even then I was naive. I thought, we're going to file it and they're going to come to their senses. But no, they fought tooth and nail on jurisdictional grounds. And even when they lost that case in 2016, so this is under the Trudeau government now, they accepted the decision and then they didn't implement it. So it's now been 10 non-compliance orders and possibly more coming against the federal government. Now this legal strategy, accompanied with all the children and other people in terms of a social movement to bring attention to these inequalities and not normalize them anymore, that's resulted in over 250,000 services and products going to First Nations kids that they otherwise wouldn't have. But I'm not after partial equality. I'm after full equity. And that's why if people are listening to me, they'll find in news things that I'm never, quote, satisfied. Because I think that First Nations kids are worth the money. And I think that they deserve every opportunity that other children in Canada already get. And part of colonialism is getting us satisfied with getting less. And I think that these kids deserve everything that everyone else gets. So no incremental equality for me, and I'm going to keep calling out discrimination whenever I see it.
Absolutely. And I don't like diving too much into work-related things on on these segments, but it's so frustrating to watch whoever, because it has been decades and decades of inequality, whoever is in power to constantly use all loopholes they can find. Commitment for 5 years. Well, we know a term never lasts longer than 4. Like even that in itself, it's like, wow, are we really not worth basic human rights? Like for me, it's just so hard to wrap my head around. And it's 100% true. We have begun or have unfortunately already normalized, well, we got a little bit. We should be thankful for at least whatever they're going to give us, which is total BS, because we are valuable, and as Indigenous peoples, we have every right to be here. We have every right to have opportunity. We have every right to self-determine what we decide to do with our life. And it infuriates me when I have to stand in the house and look at a bunch of typically older white men and say, my people are dying. Why can't you provide funding for it?
Yeah.
Why can't you provide funding for services and resources that we need? It boggles my mind.
And there's a real danger in being patient. They ask us always to be patient. I saw your wonderful intervention on the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report. The fact that the government has said, well, we'll get to that later. We can't deal with that right now because we got COVID going on. They've known about this issue for decades. And they have a duty to respond, and they're choosing not to. And in that choosing not to, and we need to make sure, be clear with everyone, it is a choice. They're choosing not to, which means that more women and girls are going to be harmed and will die. And they have died in this, even a short little time that we've been, since they've announced that report going thing. I've seen women who have gone missing and women who have died. So there's consequences to their choices, but there's hubris in their idea that they get to think that they get to set the pace of change. So they say that we're the ones, the government gets to set the pace of change, not the people who have experienced discrimination at our hands. We get to claim that space. And the other is that they almost want to define the harm that we've experienced. They want to define it in a way that means that distances responsibility, they can pass it off to another government. The real harm was done by the previous government, that we're different. They proclaim themselves benevolent in the administration of discrimination. And they want us to be thankful to them for the discrimination. And I think that we have to be clear that any level of discrimination is not something that deserves gratitude. It deserves a very clear and consistent, but respectful and forceful voice that says, no, we are just as valuable as you are. We deserve to exist as we wish. We are human beings, and we're not going to put up with getting less, right? And I think that that's something that there's many kind of voices starting to kind of join that chorus, but it's still not strong enough.
And I think it's something that, in a way, Canada has done so well. For myself, when I look at the timeline and what the UN Declaration, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People legislation went through, we saw it get shot down in Senate, and it never came to be. But if you look at what that document went through and the involvement that Canada had, was a big part, was significant, had wonderful contributions. So why can't our own country pass legislation that we contributed to, and we have leaders that say we need to have this? That even in that, Canada has done a really good job at hiding Canadian history, hiding the history of Indigenous peoples and the relationship that it has to Canada. The media continues to portray us as less than. It's the Tina Fontaine trial. It's the Colton Bushey. It's not their trial. They are the victims. We see it continuously in so many ways. And even just thinking about the movies I watched as a kid, the movies we watch as children, the bad characters, what we say are the bad characters, are often darker skin, or they're of an obviously different ethnic background than the other main characters.